One of the most misunderstood things about avoidant people is this idea that they do not feel deeply. People assume that because they appear distant, emotionally controlled, or detached, they must not care. But that is rarely true. In many cases, avoidants feel emotions very intensely. They have simply trained themselves to disconnect from those emotions because vulnerability feels unsafe to them. And this is exactly why your absence affects them so powerfully. You see, while connection is happening, the avoidant mind is constantly managing emotional pressure. They stay busy. They intellectualize feelings. They create space. They distract themselves with work routines, independence, or even emotional withdrawal. Not because they are evil or manipulative, but because closeness activates fear inside them. Real intimacy requires emotional exposure, and for an avoidant personality, exposure often feels dangerous. So while you are present, they can maintain the illusion of control. Even if they care about you deeply, they can keep your love at a distance emotionally. They know you are there. They know the connection exists. And strangely enough, your constant presence allows them to avoid confronting the depth of what they actually feel. But the moment you step away, truly step away, something changes psychologically. Your silence removes the distraction. Your absence removes the emotional safety net they secretly relied on. And suddenly there is space. Space forces awareness. This is the part most people never understand. Avoidants often process emotions in reverse. While emotionally expressive people feel everything during the relationship, avoidants frequently feel the full weight of emotions after distance occurs. Why? Because the nervous system finally becomes quiet enough for reality to catch up with them. When the texts stop coming, when the emotional reassurance disappears, when your energy is no longer reaching toward them, they are left alone with themselves. And that is where the real conflict begins. Because now they can no longer focus on managing closeness. Instead, they must confront loss. And loss has a way of bypassing emotional defenses. Human psychology is deeply wired around attachment. Even the people who fear connection still become attached to emotional consistency, emotional safety, and familiar energy. Your presence became part of their emotional structure, whether they admitted it or not. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once wrote that most human suffering comes from the inability to sit quietly alone in a room. Avoidants are no exception to this truth. In fact, silence often becomes the mirror they spent years trying to avoid. Without your presence, they begin hearing their own thoughts more clearly. They replay conversations. They revisit memories. They start recognizing the emotional importance of moments they minimized before. And here is the irony. The very intimacy they feared becomes the thing they miss most. Not because loneliness suddenly made them weak, but because absence creates contrast. Human beings rarely understand value while something is constantly available to them. We understand value through emptiness, through interruption, through silence. That is why chasing rarely awakens an avoidant. Pressure only activates more defense mechanisms, but absence creates reflection. Distance creates emotional visibility. And this does not happen overnight. Sometimes the avoidant initially feels relief when space is created. The pressure disappears. The expectations disappear. But after that temporary relief fades, another feeling slowly emerges underneath it. Emotional recognition. They begin to realize what your presence actually meant. The emotional support, the consistency, the warmth, the understanding, the quiet sense of connection they convinced themselves they did not need. And this realization can feel overwhelming because avoidants are often forced to confront two painful truths at the same time. They deeply wanted love and they were deeply afraid of it. That internal contradiction is where their silence often comes from. So if you truly want to understand why your absence affects an avoidant so deeply, understand this. Your absence removes their ability to escape themselves. And eventually the silence says everything your presence never could. One of the deepest realizations an avoidant experiences after separation is not simply that they miss a person. It is that they miss the emotional security that person quietly brought into their life. And this distinction matters because avoidants are often disconnected from their own emotional needs while the relationship is happening. They focus on maintaining freedom, minimizing vulnerability, and protecting themselves from emotional dependency. But what they fail to recognize in the moment is how profoundly human beings depend on emotional stability, even when they pretend not to. The truth is, emotional security is one of the rarest experiences in modern life. It is easy to find attention, easy to find attraction, easy to find temporary excitement, but genuine emotional safety, the feeling that someone sees you, understands you, and consistently chooses you without manipulation or performance, that is rare. And avoidants often do not fully recognize its value until it disappears. When you were there, your presence likely became part of the emotional balance they depended on unconsciously. Maybe you were the calm voice during their stress. Maybe you brought patience into their chaos. Maybe you understood their silence without demanding constant explanations. You became a source of emotional regulation without even realizing it. Psychologists understand something important about human attachment. People regulate emotions through relationships. We calm each other's nervous systems. We stabilize each other psychologically. Healthy connection creates internal safety. And even individuals who fear intimacy still benefit from that stability more than they admit. But avoidants tend to intellectualize relationships instead of emotionally experiencing them in real time. They focus on flaws. They focus on pressure. They focus on maintaining distance. So while you are actively giving love, support, patience, and consistency, they often underestimate the emotional role you are playing in their life until you are gone. Then something subtle but powerful begins happening beneath the surface. The emotional atmosphere changes. Life starts feeling colder, quieter, less grounded. The routines remain, but the emotional energy behind them disappears. They may continue functioning externally, going to work, talking to friends, distracting themselves, but internally, there is a growing awareness that something stabilizing has vanished. And this is where the avoidant mind faces a difficult truth. Independence is not the same thing as emotional fulfillment. Many avoidants build their identity around self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone. I'm fine alone. Emotions complicate life. These beliefs become psychological armor, but armor also isolates. Over time, the avoidant starts realizing that the relationship was not trapping them the way they feared. In many ways, it was supporting them. The ancient philosopher Aristotle once said that human beings are social creatures by nature. No amount of emotional defense can completely erase that reality. People are wired for connection. Not superficial attention, but meaningful emotional bonds. And when someone consistently provides emotional safety, the nervous system remembers it, even after separation. That memory becomes difficult to escape. Suddenly, the avoidant begins comparing every interaction to what they lost. Casual conversations feel empty. New connections feel surface level. Temporary distractions stop working the same way they once did. Because once someone experiences genuine emotional understanding, it becomes harder to return to emotional numbness without feeling the difference. And here is what makes this realization so painful for avoidants. They often recognize the value of emotional security only after they have already pushed it away. Not because they wanted to lose it, but because fear distorted their perception while they still had it. Fear convinced them closeness was pressure, vulnerability was danger, dependence was weakness, but absence exposes reality. It strips away defensive narratives and reveals emotional truth. And emotional truth is simple. People miss the environments where they felt safest being themselves. That is what your presence represented. Not perfection, not control, not obsession. Safety. The kind of safety that allowed them to breathe emotionally without constantly defending themselves from the world. When that disappears, the avoidant often begins to understand something they resisted for a very long time. The right relationship was never taking away their freedom. It was giving their soul a place to rest, and sometimes people only recognize the value of peace after they are forced to live without it. One of the greatest illusions the avoidant mind creates is the belief that emotional independence means emotional freedom. On the surface, avoidants often appear incredibly self-sufficient. They pride themselves on needing little from others. They convince themselves that distance equals strength, that detachment equals control, and that relying on no one protects them from pain. But eventually, life exposes a truth that psychology has understood for centuries. Human beings are not designed to exist without emotional connection. And your absence is often the moment that illusion begins to collapse. While you were present, the avoidant could maintain the story they told themselves. They could convince themselves that the relationship was optional, that your support was replaceable, that emotional closeness was not truly necessary. Because as long as you remained there, texting, caring, understanding, showing up emotionally, they never had to experience the full reality of losing you. Presence can hide emotional dependence. Absence reveals it. The moment you step back, something subtle but deeply psychological starts happening. The avoidant begins noticing the emotional spaces you once occupied without effort. Certain moments feel strangely empty. Certain routines lose meaning. The energy they once took for granted disappears, and suddenly life feels less emotionally alive. This realization rarely arrives dramatically at first. It often begins quietly. A conversation they wish they could share with you. A stressful day where they instinctively think about reaching out. A moment of success that somehow feels incomplete. A silence at night that feels heavier than before. And these small moments accumulate. What they are experiencing is not simply loneliness. It is the breakdown of emotional denial. Because despite all their attempts to appear unaffected, the human nervous system always forms attachments to consistency, care, and emotional familiarity. You became psychologically woven into their everyday experience, whether they consciously acknowledged it or not. The philosopher Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is exactly what happens here. Avoidants often move through relationships unconsciously protecting themselves from intimacy while unconsciously depending on the very connection they claim not to need. But absence forces consciousness. Without your presence buffering their emotions, they begin confronting needs they spent years suppressing. They realize that independence did not erase emotional dependency. It simply hid it beneath distraction and control. And this is important to understand. There is nothing weak about emotional need. Modern culture often glorifies hyper-independence as strength, but psychologically, extreme self-isolation is usually a defense mechanism, not a sign of emotional mastery. True strength is not the absence of need. True strength is the ability to experience connection without fear controlling you. Avoidants frequently confuse emotional closeness with loss of identity. Somewhere in their development, vulnerability became associated with danger, engulfment, rejection, or disappointment. So they learned to survive by minimizing dependence on others. But survival mechanisms are not the same thing as fulfillment. Eventually, every defense strategy creates a cost. And the cost of emotional avoidance is often realized only through loss. When your energy disappears, the avoidant is forced to face life without the emotional structure your presence quietly provided. They begin understanding how much of their emotional balance was connected to your consistency. The conversations, the reassurance, the emotional grounding, the feeling that someone genuinely cared about their inner world, all of it mattered far more than they admitted. This is why avoidants often seem emotionally delayed after separation. While other people process emotions during the relationship, avoidants frequently process emotions after the relationship loses stability. Distance removes the distractions. It interrupts the illusion of total independence. And once that illusion cracks, deeper awareness begins emerging. Suddenly, they realize they did not simply lose a relationship. They lost emotional connection. They lost emotional familiarity. They lost someone who softened the harshness of life in ways they barely noticed while it was happening. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is this: the freedom they fought so hard to protect can begin feeling painfully empty when there is no one meaningful left to share life with. Because at the deepest level, human beings are not fulfilled by avoidance. They are fulfilled by connection. And eventually, even the most guarded heart discovers that independence means very little when it costs you the people who made life feel emotionally alive. One of the most psychologically revealing moments for an avoidant person happens when they realize they may not have unlimited access to you anymore. As long as they believe you will always be there, always understanding, always patient, always emotionally available, a part of them remains emotionally complacent. They assume the connection can be revisited later. They assume they have time. And because they assume they have time, they delay emotional accountability. This is one of the paradoxes of avoidant attachment. The avoidant often fears intimacy, but at the same time depends on the security of knowing the relationship still exists. They may pull away emotionally, create distance, or resist vulnerability, yet internally, they are comforted by the belief that the bond remains accessible whenever they decide to reconnect. But the human mind responds very differently once permanence becomes uncertain. The moment your energy changes, truly changes, the avoidant nervous system begins reacting in ways they cannot easily control. And notice, this is not triggered by arguments alone. Arguments can still feel emotionally familiar. Conflict still keeps emotional attachment alive. What truly shakes the avoidant is emotional absence, detachment, silence, the realization that you may genuinely be moving forward without them. Because suddenly, the relationship is no longer theoretical. Loss becomes real. And psychologically, human beings assign far greater value to what they believe they can permanently lose. Behavioral psychology calls this loss aversion. People are often more emotionally impacted by the fear of losing something than by the pleasure of having it. The avoidant is no exception to this principle. In fact, because avoidants suppress emotional awareness during connection, the threat of irreversible loss can hit them with unexpected intensity. At first, they may resist this feeling. They may distract themselves. They may convince themselves they do not care. Pride often becomes the first defense mechanism. Ego whispers, "You're fine. Stay detached. Don't react." But underneath the surface, anxiety begins growing quietly. Not anxiety about control, anxiety about finality. Because deep down, they begin sensing something dangerous to the avoidant psyche. You are no longer emotionally waiting for them. And this changes the entire emotional dynamic. When someone is constantly chasing an avoidant, the avoidant remains psychologically in the position of power. They feel emotionally pursued, which paradoxically allows them to maintain distance. But when the pursuit stops, uncertainty enters the system, and uncertainty destabilizes emotional defenses. Now they begin wondering, what if this time they are really gone? What if I push too far? What if I never get another chance? These thoughts create internal tension because avoidants are often unprepared for emotional consequences. Their coping strategy has always been distance. But distance no longer feels safe once it threatens permanent separation. This is why many avoidants suddenly reappear after long silence. Not necessarily because they fully healed, but because reality interrupted the fantasy that connection would always remain available. Your emotional withdrawal forces them to confront something they spent years avoiding, attachment itself. And attachment is powerful because it is tied to survival mechanisms deep within the human brain. Neuroscience shows that emotional bonds activate many of the same systems involved in safety, stability, and emotional regulation. So when a meaningful attachment feels endangered, the nervous system reacts. Even highly avoidant individuals experience this internally, though they may struggle to express it openly. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And that perfectly describes the avoidant experience here. For years, they protected freedom above all else. Freedom from expectations, freedom from vulnerability, freedom from emotional dependence. But eventually, they discover that too much emotional distance creates another kind of fear, the fear of ending up alone with choices they cannot undo. And that realization can be deeply destabilizing, because now they are forced to confront the possibility that the person who loved them consistently may no longer be emotionally reachable. Your absence becomes evidence that life continues without them. And nothing shakes emotional complacency more than realizing someone you relied on emotionally is learning how to live without your presence. At that moment, the avoidant often feels something they spent years suppressing. Regret, because people rarely panic when they lose what they never valued. They panic when they realize they valued it too late. One of the most fascinating psychological shifts that happens inside an avoidant after separation is the way memory begins to transform. While the relationship is active, avoidants often focus heavily on pressure, flaws, expectations, or fears connected to intimacy. Their mind becomes conditioned to search for emotional threats because that is how they maintain distance and protect themselves from vulnerability. But once the relationship is gone and emotional pressure disappears, something unexpected begins happening. The emotional narrative starts changing. They begin romanticizing the connection they once resisted. And this is not simply nostalgia. It is a deeper psychological process involving emotional clarity, distance, and the human tendency to understand meaning more fully in retrospect than in the present moment. When people are emotionally overwhelmed, they often cannot perceive relationships clearly. Fear distorts perception. Anxiety narrows focus. The avoidant, while inside the relationship, may have been so focused on protecting independence that they overlooked the beauty of what was actually happening. Instead of fully experiencing love, they experienced the fear of losing themselves inside love. But absence changes perspective. Once the emotional intensity of closeness fades, the avoidant nervous system finally relaxes enough to process memories without the same defensive reactions. And suddenly moments they once minimized begin resurfacing with new emotional weight. The way you listened to them, the way you understood their silence, the emotional safety they felt around you, the consistency they quietly depended on, the small moments of connection they barely acknowledged at the time. Memory becomes emotionally selective after loss. And psychology has long understood this phenomenon. Human beings often reconstruct emotional experiences based on what they now realize they lost. In other words, once the fear of intimacy subsides, the avoidant can finally access the emotional value of the relationship more honestly. This is why avoidants often appear emotionally delayed. Their realization does not always happen during connection. It happens after distance creates reflection, and reflection can be dangerous for someone who spent years suppressing emotion. Because now the avoidant is no longer distracted by the mechanics of the relationship. There are no daily conflicts to focus on, no expectations demanding emotional presence, no immediate pressure activating their defenses. There is only memory, and memory has a powerful way of revealing emotional truth. The philosopher Marcel Proust once wrote that remembrance of things past is not necessarily the remembrance of things as they were. That idea matters deeply here. The avoidant is not replaying events like a machine. They are reinterpreting emotional meaning. And often what they discover is painful. The relationship contained far more love, peace, and emotional depth than they allowed themselves to recognize while they still had it. So they begin idealizing certain memories. Not because the relationship was perfect, but because emotional distance highlights emotional significance. Human beings are remarkably poor at appreciating stability while living inside it. We adapt quickly to love, consistency, and emotional support. We normalize them. We assume they will remain available. But once those things disappear, the mind begins revisiting them with heightened emotional awareness. And for the avoidant, this process can feel overwhelming because it creates internal contradiction. The same closeness they once feared now becomes the source of longing. The same vulnerability they resisted now becomes evidence of emotional meaning. This is why avoidants sometimes reconnect unexpectedly months later. It is not always manipulation. Sometimes they have genuinely arrived at emotional realizations too late. Time gave them perspective their fear would not allow earlier. But here is the tragedy. Awareness does not erase consequences. By the time the avoidant fully understands the value of the relationship, the other person may have emotionally moved on. Healing may have already happened. Emotional doors may have quietly closed. And this creates a painful form of regret because regret is rarely about losing perfection. Regret comes from recognizing meaning too late to fully recover it. The avoidant starts understanding that love was never the true threat. The true threat was fear itself. Fear of intimacy, fear of dependence, fear of emotional exposure. And in protecting themselves from temporary vulnerability, they may have sacrificed something deeply real. That realization stays with people. Because eventually memory stops asking, why did I pull away? And starts asking a far more painful question. Why did I only recognize the depth of the connection after it was gone? Perhaps the most powerful moment in this entire dynamic is not when the avoidant misses you, reaches out, or even begins regretting the loss. The deepest psychological shift often happens when they see that you are no longer emotionally waiting for them. When they realize you are healing, growing, rebuilding your life, and emotionally detaching from the connection that once defined so much of your energy. Because nothing confronts avoidance more directly than witnessing someone reclaim their emotional power. For a long time, the avoidant may have unconsciously relied on your consistency. Even while creating distance, they often assumed your emotional availability would remain intact. They believed the connection could stay suspended in time while they sorted through their fears, confusion, or emotional defenses. And in many cases, they never fully imagined what it would feel like to see you genuinely move forward. But growth changes the emotional equation completely. When you stop chasing, when you stop trying to convince them of your worth, when your attention shifts back toward your own life, the avoidant loses the emotional certainty they quietly depended on. And psychologically, this can be deeply destabilizing. Because your healing forces comparison, it becomes a mirror they cannot easily avoid. Human beings naturally evaluate themselves through contrast, and when the avoidant sees you becoming emotionally stronger while they remain emotionally conflicted, it creates internal discomfort. Suddenly, the narrative changes. You are no longer the person waiting for clarity. You become the person creating clarity within yourself. That transformation carries enormous psychological weight. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said that people do not hate weakness. They hate the reminder of their own weakness. In many ways, your growth becomes that reminder. Not because healing is meant to punish anyone, but because your emotional evolution exposes the areas where the avoidant remained emotionally stagnant. They begin noticing things differently. Your absence no longer feels temporary. Your silence no longer feels emotional. Your energy no longer feels attached to them. And perhaps most painfully, they begin sensing that your happiness may no longer require their presence. That realization strikes at the core of avoidant psychology because avoidants often maintain emotional distance while unconsciously expecting relational stability to remain available in the background. But your growth communicates something undeniable. Life is continuing without them. And life continuing without them forces emotional accountability. Now they must confront questions they avoided during the relationship. Why was I so afraid of closeness? Why did I push away someone who genuinely cared? Why did it take losing emotional connection to recognize its value? These questions become difficult to silence because your healing removes their ability to hide behind old emotional dynamics. You are no longer participating in the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. You are no longer trying to rescue the connection alone. And once that dynamic ends, the avoidant is left face to face with their own emotional patterns. This is where growth becomes powerful, but not as revenge, but as revelation. Because true healing changes your energy. People can feel it. You speak differently. You carry yourself differently. Your emotional dependence dissolves. And when someone who once centered their emotional world around another person suddenly redirects that energy inward, it creates emotional distance that feels very real. The avoidant senses the shift. And ironically, this is often when they begin feeling the strongest emotional pull towards you. Not because you are trying harder, but because you stopped abandoning yourself for the relationship. Your self-respect creates clarity. Your emotional stability creates contrast. And contrast creates awareness. For the first time, they may fully see what they lost. not just a relationship, not just attention, but a person who genuinely loved them while they were still struggling to love themselves fully. And that recognition can stay with someone for years, because there is something profoundly haunting about watching a person you once had access to become emotionally unreachable through growth rather than anger. Anger still contains attachment, but peace signals completion, and that is the final lesson avoidants are often forced to confront. Sometimes the greatest loss is not hearing someone say goodbye, it is realizing they no longer need to. At the end of all of this, what we begin to understand is that avoidant behavior was never truly about a lack of feeling. It was about fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of losing control emotionally. And because of that fear, many avoidants spend years convincing themselves that distance protects them, when in reality, distance slowly disconnects them from the very thing every human being is searching for: meaningful emotional connection. But life has a way of revealing truth through absence. When your presence disappears, the avoidant is forced into confrontation with themselves. The silence becomes reflective. The emotional safety they once overlooked becomes unforgettable. The illusion of complete independence begins to crack. The fear of losing you becomes real. Memories grow heavier. Regret grows clearer. And perhaps most painfully of all, they witness the one person who truly loved them learning how to live without them. That is when emotional realization often arrives.